A recent military action has really sent shockwaves across global politics. We're talking advanced B-2 stealth bombers flying an incredible 37 hours straight to Iran's nuclear facilities.
Yeah, dropping these massive bunker-busting bombs.
Exactly. And the U.S. government, immediately proclaimed it a spectacular success. They were claiming they'd averted Iran's nuclear threat, maybe even hinted at potential regime change.
But what's really striking, I think, is how quickly that narrative started to fray. Within, what, 24 hours?
Just 24 hours, yeah. American media began asking questions.
Right, and the experts looking at the situation on the ground and the global political chessboard, they started seeing a very different picture unfold. That initial triumphant story, it began to unravel pretty fast.
So what is really going on behind those headlines? That's our mission for this deep dive,
Right.
to unpack the true impact, both militarily and politically.
And the ripple effects, too, they're surprising.
Absolutely, from international diplomacy right down to domestic U.S. politics. Okay, let's get right into it. So this operation, codenamed Midnight Hammer, the scale was massive.
Truly massive.
Over 125 aircraft involved in this assault on Iran. You've got those iconic B-2 stealth bombers, alongside cutting-edge 4th and 5th gen fighters, with the stealth and networked capabilities, and of course the refueling tankers needed for that kind of range.
Essential for a 37-hour mission.
Definitely. And they unleashed 75 precision-guided bombs. Now, this included, crucially, 14 of those GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators.
A brand new type of bomb, right?
Yeah.
3,000 pounds each. First time they've been used in combat.
First time.
Yeah.
Plus 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles, the more conventional option.
And the targets?
3 key Iranian nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Now, it's worth remembering, Israel had hit these places before.
Right, but the feeling was perhaps the job wasn't complete.
Seems that way.
And President Trump, right after the strike, he was absolutely unequivocal, declared it a spectacular success for America. That message was echoed loud and clear by his administration.
Okay, so given that initial, triumphant claim, where should we start looking to really assess the actual damage on the ground? What does the evidence show?
Well, let's start with Fordo. It's often described as Iran's most secure nuclear facility.
Because it's buried so deep.
Exactly, deep under mountains. It houses advanced centrifuges doing significant uranium enrichment work. Now, the attack specifically targeted its tunnel ventilation system.
The idea being to damage the tunnels inside, wreck the centrifuges.
That seems to be the logic, yes.
Yeah.
And post-strike satellite imagery, it did show clear bomb hits on the surface. There was this distinct gray-blue ash coating visible.
Okay, so signs of impact.
Definitely signs of impact on the surface.
Okay.
But here's the crucial point that emerged pretty quickly. There's a critical lack of evidence that these massive bombs actually damaged the deep subsurface tunnels themselves.
How deep are we talking?
Between 200 and 300 meters below ground. Fordo was specifically designed, hardened, to withstand exactly this kind of attack.
Right.
And the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, they couldn't confirm any underground damage or the destruction of centrifuges.
That's quite a gap between the claim and the verified reality. So the defenses might have actually held up despite the force used.
It certainly looks that way for the deepest parts.
And just as a side note, it's kind of interesting that this much-hyped GBU-57 bomb, it's made by Boeing.
Ah, yes. Given the recent difficulties with aircraft, some might see a bit of irony there.
A little bit, maybe.
But, even more significant than the lack of verified deep damage is something else, a crucial pre-strike development.
Oh, what's that?
Heavy activity was observed at Fordo on June 19th and 20th, just before the strike.
Activity like what?
Experts now believe Iran used that window, that period of activity, to move about 60% of its enriched uranium out of Fordo.
60%. How much is that?
About 400 kilograms, which is, theoretically enough material for around 10 nuclear bombs, moved before the attack.
Wow. So the most valuable stuff potentially wasn't even there when the bombs hit.
All the signs point to the research material and that enriched uranium still being intact somewhere else, still in Iran's possession.
That completely changes the assessment of the strike's effectiveness at Fordo, doesn't it?
Fundamentally, it suggests they anticipated something, or at least took precautions.
Okay, so Fordo seems less than a spectacular success. What about Natanz? That's Iran's largest uranium enrichment site, right?
It is. Natanz is interesting because it has both above-ground and below-ground sections. Now, the above-ground part, that had already been hit by Israel in the past.
Right.
So this time the U.S. deployed its MOPs, those big bunker busters, aiming specifically at the underground sections. And Maxar satellite images, they do show damage to the original complex.
Damage, yes, but completely destroyed.
Well, that's where the debate is. Some underground structures certainly sustained damage, you can see it in the imagery, but whether they were completely destroyed, that's still being debated by analysts.
So, again, maybe not the total annihilation initially claimed. And the third site, Isfahan, that was hit by Tomahawks, wasn't it?
Correct. Tomahawk cruise missiles. And interestingly, Israel had previously claimed total destruction of this facility.
So what's the assessment this time?
Well, what's really notable, or perhaps telling, is the absence of any radiation leak reports from Isfahan after this U.S. strike.
Meaning?
It raises questions about whether nuclear material or enriched uranium was actually the main target there this time, or if it was even present in large quantities.
So if we look at the overall picture for Iran...
Yeah, their likely strategy seems to be one of dispersal, just like they do with their ballistic missiles. Spread out the critical components, the uranium, the centrifuges, the hardware, the research, move it to different, possibly hidden locations. Don't keep all your eggs in one basket, basically.
Makes sense from their perspective.
Absolutely. So to kind of summarize the damage assessment part, did Iran's nuclear sites get hit? Yes. Did they get, quote, a strong shock? Certainly.
But destroyed. Project over.
Experts widely believe their nuclear project is likely not destroyed and can, in fact, carry on. Which naturally leads us to a pretty important question.
Which is?
What was the true long-term effectiveness of this massive, expensive strike beyond the immediate explosions and headlines?
And that's where things get really interesting, because that initial claim, that spectacular success, it just crumbled so fast.
The shift in the official U.S. narrative within just 24 hours was, frankly, remarkable.
Right. You go from spectacular military success, completely and totally annihilated nuclear enrichment facilities, job done.
Very definitive language.
To suddenly acknowledging that actually work to permanently dismantle the nuclear program would take years.
Years. Not days, not weeks. Years.
That is a huge shift.
It is. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's not just about, say, the taxpayer money spent on these huge bombs, although that's part of it.
What's the key insight then?
I think the key insight is how the very idea of modern military success is being redefined right before our eyes.
Yeah.
What might have once been presented as a decisive knockout blow.
Like mission accomplished.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
It now looks more like just the opening move in a much longer, much more complicated, and ultimately much more expensive game of political and military chess.
And this whole situation has also created what some people are starting to call an international comedy.
Hey, yeah, that's one way to put it.
I mean, there was a time, maybe decades ago, when U.S. intervention, especially if framed as bringing democracy, might have been welcomed or at least tolerated more widely.
Definitely a different era.
But now, it feels like the complete opposite. This isn't just a diplomatic slip-up, is it?
No, I think the critical insight here is that this perceived international comedy points to something deeper. It reflects a significant erosion of U.S. soft power. Well, it shows a fundamental shift in how other global players, not just rivals like China and Russia, but maybe even some allies, now perceive and react to American unilateral action. It signals, perhaps, a new phase where U.S. intervention is met with way more skepticism, maybe even outright opposition, not automatic acceptance.
And we're seeing that play out.
Clearly, you have major powers like China and Russia openly calling the U.S. action undemocratic, illegal, a violation of the UN Charter.
Strong words.
Very strong. And you see growing international support, or at least sympathy, for Iran in this context. Specifically, you had Russia's former president, Dmitry Medvedev, making this really provocative statement.
What did he say?
Suggesting other countries might now directly provide nuclear warheads to Iran. Now, whether that's bluster or a real threat.
It's still a significant statement.
Hugely significant. And then you have the Iranian foreign minister reportedly visiting Moscow, meeting Putin. It definitely hints at Russia seeing an opportunity here to leverage the situation, put more pressure on the West.
And Iran's own response, their retaliation.
It was swift. And in some ways, maybe surprisingly easy, quote unquote.
What did they do?
Their parliament quickly approved closing the Strait of Hormuz.
The oil choke point.
Exactly. A critical choke point. 20–25% of the world's oil and gas passes through there. A huge chunk of India's oil imports, for example.
That's a major economic threat.
Massive.
Yeah.
And what was the U.S. reaction to this threat? This is maybe the most astonishing part.
Go on.
The U.S., which, let's be honest, views China as a major geopolitical competitor, imposes tariffs, calls it a threat.
Right.
is now reportedly requesting China, its communist rival, to step in, to intercede with Iran to keep the strait open.
Wow. Asking your rival for help against the consequences of your own action.
It reveals the really complex and frankly somewhat contradictory international dynamics at play right now.
Okay, so huge international ripples. But the blowback wasn't just global, was it? It hit home, too, right here in the U.S.
Oh, absolutely. Significant repercussions domestically.
Let's dig into that. This idea that some people are now talking about, the United States of Israel. Where does that come from?
Well, it taps into this unique dynamic Trump has with his core supporters, his mega fan base.
Explain that dynamic.
It's often described as an almost unwavering belief, like he can do no wrong. He's very carefully cultivated this image over the years. The war-stopping president, the deal-making president, the peacemaker.
Right, citing his claims about solving Russia, Ukraine, India, Pakistan, his desire for a Nobel Prize.
Exactly. He built this brand around not getting America into new wars.
So what happened this time?
What's so noteworthy, and I think really unprecedented in recent U.S. history, is that for the first time, a president is facing serious vocal criticism over starting a military action from his own core voter base.
His own supporters are pushing back.
Significantly. Many of them feel utterly betrayed
Why betrayed?
because they see him as having pushed America into war. And crucially, the perception among many of them is that he did it because Israel said so.
Instead of focusing on domestic issues.
Right. Instead of fulfilling promises they cared about, like controlling inflation or bring back good days, whatever that means to them, they feel he pushed them, meaning America, into the fire of the Middle East again.
And this feeds into that United States of Israel idea.
Precisely. It reflects this growing realization, or at least perception, among some Americans, including maybe Trump supporters, that U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, isn't primarily driven by American interests, but effectively dictated by Israeli interests, specifically Netanyahu's interests.
Is there evidence of this sentiment beyond just general feeling?
Yeah, and it's not just online chatter. You have very prominent Trump supporters, like Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene,
A strong ally of his.
a very strong ally. And she came out explicitly stating that Netanyahu pushed for this attack on Iran for his own political reasons because his chair was shaking back home. She literally said, "It seems political."
That's a remarkable statement coming from her.
It's hugely significant. It shows this criticism isn't just from the fringes. It's coming from deep within his own camp.
So it's not just about Democrats versus Republicans anymore.
Well, it highlights how many people are starting to feel that U.S. politics, especially foreign policy, is heavily influenced not just by the two main parties, but by powerful lobbying groups. APCU is mentioned, likely meaning AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby.
Which lobbies Congress, effectively.
Very effectively, yes, leading to these kinds of synchronized messages you often hear. We got to support Israel, regardless of the context or consequences.
And how is the Trump administration, or figures close to it like Vance, responding to this base backlash?
Well, we've seen Vance trying to reassure the Mangura base, but the approach seems quite informal, almost dismissive. Sort of a trust us, bro attitude.
Saying what, basically?
Claiming that this administration, the Trump-Vance team, they know how to handle national security. They're competent, unlike, as he implied, dumb presidents before them.
But doesn't that contradict their earlier message?
That's the apparent contradiction, yes. It seems to go directly against those earlier promises that they would keep America out of foreign entanglements, not start new ones.
And there are reports of trying to silence dissent.
Yeah, we're hearing reports of orders to remove or maybe even ban people within the movement who question Trump and Vance on this, which, usually just adds fuel to the fire when people feel they're being silenced.
It's a tense situation within his own base, then.
Very tense.
Now, perhaps the most revealing thing here is Trump's own pivot, almost immediately after the strike.
What pivot was that?
Well, after initially claiming the strike was a total success against the nuclear program, within 24 hours, he started talking about regime change in Iran.
Ah, right. That's a big shift in rhetoric.
Huge, because for months leading up to this, the public justification was always laser-focused on the nuclear bomb threat, not the Iranian regime itself. He explicitly said it wasn't about regime change.
So why this sudden shift to talking about regime change? What are the typical U.S. interests associated with that in Iran?
Well, historically, the perceived interests often include things like opening up new markets for U.S. companies, potential for investments, and, of course, access to cheaper oil.
And there are whispers about who might lead a post-regime change Iran.
There are suggestions, yes, that a prepared person is sort of waiting in the wings, specifically, the son of a previous leader, the Shah.
Interesting. Always seems to be someone waiting.
If Trump genuinely wants that Nobel Peace Prize he talks about,
Yeah.
maybe an alternative path, a truly prize-worthy one, would be to actually try and bring both Israel and Iran to the negotiating table,
Yeah.
aim for a real, lasting peace agreement.
There would be something. You could even theoretically suggest a disarmament for all approach in the region.
Meaning?
Well, if the argument is Iran absolutely cannot have nuclear bombs because they're too dangerous,
Right.
then the logical follow-up for consistency would be that Israel should also disarm its alleged nuclear arsenal, make the whole region nuclear-free.
Has that ever happened? Countries giving up nuclear weapons?
It has. History provides precedents. Think about South Africa. They built bombs and then dismantled them.
Yeah.
Ukraine gave up its Soviet-era arsenal.
Mm.
So it's not impossible, technically or politically, though obviously extremely difficult.
Of course, the U.S. doesn't officially acknowledge Israel has nukes.
Correct. The official U.S. line is that Israel doesn't officially possess nuclear weapons, and the U.S. policy is deliberately ambiguous.
Yeah.
They don't ask. Israel doesn't confirm or deny. It's called nuclear opacity.
So, coming back to Trump's current situation, this domestic backlash, the international fallout,
Yeah.
what's his strategic dilemma now?
It seems his perhaps cynical best option, politically speaking, might be for Iran to retaliate by attacking the U.S. directly.
Why would that be his best option?
Because that would likely rally the American public, including his base, behind him and justify further, much larger strikes without the same domestic criticism. It would change the narrative from him starting a conflict to him responding to an attack.
But what if Iran doesn't attack the U.S.?
Well, if Iran instead focuses its retaliation on Israel, or if it actually follows through and closes the Strait of Hormuz, then that only exacerbates the difficulties for Trump and for America. It deepens the economic pain, complicates the alliances, and makes it much harder politically to launch further, quote, unprovoked attacks.
It really puts him in a bind.
A very tight bind. And this whole situation, it really raises an important, maybe uncomfortable question about double standards.
How so?
Look at the intense U.S. concern, suddenly focused on Iran, its democracy, women's rights, safety, and especially its nuclear weapons program, leading to military action.
Okay.
Now, contrast that with North Korea. They have nuclear weapons. They have a terrible human rights record. They're certainly not a democracy. Yet, there's a complete lack of similar high-profile concern leading to military intervention there.
Why the difference in approach?
Well, it strongly suggests the focus isn't really about abstract principles of democracy or human rights or even just nuclear non-proliferation in general. It seems to boil down more to geopolitics, perceived threats to specific interests, and maybe, crudely, who has more bombs already. It seems less about what's universally right or wrong.
A calculation of power and interest rather than principle.
It often appears that way, yes.
So quite a complex picture we've just explored. We started with this highly touted military strike.
Yeah, claimed as a huge success.
Only to find his actual impact on the ground is, well, uncertain at best. And then this cascade of political and diplomatic consequences that followed, both around the world and right here in the U.S.
It really unfolded in unexpected ways.
Definitely.
And maybe this leaves us, and you listening, with a final kind of provocative thought to mull over.
Go for it.
Is the global focus, when push comes to shove, purely on military might, on who possesses more bombs and missiles? Is it less about principles of collective security, international law, or what we might consider right and wrong?
And if that's the case?
Well, what does that mean for nations caught in the crosshairs of these power plays? And maybe more importantly, what are the long-term implications for global stability if this pattern where might makes right or seems to continues? We encourage you to reflect on those questions. Think about what truly makes a nation secure and what a truly just international order might look like.